Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Lolly, and I want to thank you for joining me on this journey as we learn more about our historical past. Last week, we focused on our origins and beginnings in Africa, and this week, we will focus on slavery. A lot has been written about slavery, so for this webinar lesson, I will discuss slavery focusing primarily on the resistance efforts of the enslaved people and their descendants. A slave is someone that cannot quit working for another person until he or she dies. They are treated as the slave owner's property, not even as a person. Slavery has taken place throughout the world for most of human history, and this was true of ancient Africa. Slavery existed in most of the ancient African empire and civilizations on the continent of Africa. If you're interested in more in-depth reading on this subject, the book that I used for a reference was entitled Life Upon These Shores by Henry Louis Gates. A lot of this information is not as child friendly as last week's lesson, but it's still very important. So if I cover something and you don't think it's appropriate for your child, please try to just modify the lesson and teach it to them at a level that they will understand. It was just so much information that I felt was important to cover. You may ask, how did the people become slaves? Well, there were different reasons. African societies, there were many different African societies, and they would go to war against each other. And the losing side, whoever lost the war, would be sold to really faraway lands so they couldn't return home. That's one way. The second way, people became slaves for periods of time to pay out debt. If they owed someone some money, they would become their slave until the bill was paid. And if you were the person that someone owed you some money, you say, well, you're going to work for me and become my slave until this bill is paid. And the third reason that people became slaves, some of them were forced into slavery to pay for a crime that they committed. So instead of going to jail, they became a slave. And the most harsh sentence is if they were sent to the salt mines, because they would stay there for such long periods of time and it was such hard work that they would die in the salt mines. Speaking of jobs that they did, what type of jobs did they do as slaves in Africa? Well, there were a variety of jobs. You could be a household servant, work for someone's house, cleaning up the house, washing the dishes. You could build buildings, and like I said, working in the salt mines, and that was the most dangerous and harsh type of job you could have in slavery. Some slaves had rights in Africa and could own property, while some societies treated their slaves like property and beat them severely if they didn't work hard enough. Beginning around the year 700, the slave trade became an important part of the African economy, and there were two major events in the history of the African slave trade. The first one was the Arab slave trade, and the second one was the European slave trade, or as we sometimes refer to it as the transatlantic slave trade. The Arab slave trade began in the year 700, which was 1500 years ago, and after the Islamic religion had taken over most of North Africa. The Arab people captured Africans in Central Africa, transported them across Africa through the Sahara Desert, and then sold them at slave markets along the Mediterranean. The enslaved Africans were then transported to Asia and the Middle East. The Arab slave trade became a major part of Africans' economy for hundreds of years. The second major event in the slave trade in Africa was the transatlantic slave trade, or like I said, the European slave trade. When Europeans, primarily from Spain and Portugal, arrived in Africa in the 1500s, they found an already established slave trade benefiting Africans' elite and rich kings and queens. The rich African leaders sold members of their enemies' clans or groups or competing ethnic groups. The Europeans formed alliances or deals with these powerful kings and queens, supplied them with weapons and money to attack and go to war against rival African communities in exchange for captives. So, for example, you have two societies or two neighborhoods. And you say, well, if I beat up this neighborhood, if everybody in this neighborhood beats up someone in that neighborhood, we're going to be the number one neighborhood. But you were pretty equal. So the Europeans came in and they gave one of the neighborhoods weapons and money so they could go to war against the other neighborhood and so they could win. And if they won, how they had to pay the Europeans back for giving them the guns were everyone they captured in that war when they went against that other neighborhood, they had to give all those people to the Europeans, and those people became the slaves. About 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World between 1502 and 1866, with 15% dying along the way in the Middle Passage and about 11 million surviving. The Middle Passage was a part of the route from Africa to the New World being the Caribbean, North and South America. Usually they got the slaves from the middle part of Africa and they moved them to the coast. Once they were at the coast, that was the first part. The second part of the passage, the Middle Passage, is when they left the coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, and made it all the way across the ocean to America and the Caribbean. And the third part of the slave trade, slave route, was when they left the place that they arrived in America and made it to the plantation. So it was Central Africa to the coast, number one, the coast to the Americas, number two, and America to the plantations, number three. 500,000 of these Africans became slaves in North America. That leaves about 10.5 million Africans not coming to North America. Where did they go? Where did all these other Africans end up? 11 million. 10.5 didn't come to America. That's a whole lot of people. Well, 6 million of that 12.5 went to Brazil. 779,000 went to Cuba, way more than North America, and that's a small island. Over 1 million went to Jamaica. Believe it or not, 550,000 Africans went to Mexico. And we usually don't even think of Mexico when we think of Black culture, but they received 100,000 more enslaved Africans than North America. Even Peru received about 150,000 Africans, which is about a third of what North America received. All of these countries bought and enslaved more Africans than North America. However, when we think of the epicenter of Black culture, today we think primarily of North America or the United States. That's very important. I cannot emphasize that enough. We receive the second to smallest amount of Africans in this country, but in North America, we reflect and embody the face of Black culture to the world. How did we get here? How did we begin our lives upon these shores? The history of most of the African American people in North America, now the United States of America, began in late August 1619, which was 1 year before the Pilgrims arrived upon the Mayflower, when the first cargo of around 20 Africans from Angola arrived aboard the English ship named the White Lion, which landed in Jamestown, Virginia. They had either been captured in a military campaign maneuver led by the Portuguese governor of the African country or Angola, or in a civil war in the Kingdom of Congo, which is now present-day northern Angola, parts of the Congo, and the southernmost Gabon. And it was a fight between two Angolan kings who would have sold their captives to the Portuguese. The first ship to Jamestown, Virginia, carried 20 Angolans on a Portuguese ship headed to Mexico, not even to America. But English pirates intercepted the Portuguese ship and stole the Africans from the Portuguese and brought them to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. These people truly were savages. It's bad enough that they took the Portuguese and the Spanish, took the Africans and were going to sell them like they weren't even human. But then the English came along. They were pirates and stole the enslaved people from the Portuguese, and brought them to North America. And that's how the first 20 enslaved Africans ended up in North America. White colonists introduced slaves into most of all of the English colonies after that first arrival of Africans. White planters in the South discovered that slave labor versus white indentured servers mean you made more money, and the race for African slaves was on. However, not all of the first Africans were slaves. Some were free Africans and had equal membership in society. But this racial freedom did not last. When the enslaved Africans first arrived, many served terms or time periods identical to white indentured servants. But by 1641, the legality of slavery was recognized and the institution of slavery was restricted to those of African descent. By 1650, Indians and some whites may still have been slaves, but now only Africans were serving life sentences. And by 1700, Rhode Island mandated by law that only Indians and Africans could be enslaved for life. Slavery was wrong in Africa, and it was wrong in America, and it could not have happened without the involvement of both groups of people. But there was a marked difference between the systems of slavery in Africa, which was due to unpaid debts or being captured in wars, and the transatlantic slave trade and racialized slavery that Europeans developed to maximize plantation production in their colonies in North America while using ethnicity or African descent as justification for slavery. So, the slave trade in Africa was based upon you owing someone some money or you were captured in a war and it was for a certain period of time. Compare that to the slave trade in America, where you were enslaved for the rest of your life until you died because you had African ancestry. So it was based on your color to justify why you were a slave in America. And that was a big difference in slavery in Africa. But they were both wrong. Slavery went on in North America for 246 years, beginning in late August 1619 when the 13th Amendment was passed by Congress to December 6, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified, which finally abolished slavery in the United States. We are human beings, and it is natural to resist inhumane treatment. 5 primary methods of resistance that enslaved Africans and their descendants used were: number 1, suicide. When they were leaving the coast of Africa during the Middle Passage in the ships, a lot of the enslaved Africans jumped overboard and killed themselves. Number 2, organized hunger strikes. The slaves would just stop eating. Number 3, they ran away. One of the most famous enslaved people that you hear about is Harriet Tubman. She led hundreds of enslaved people to freedom. Number 4, rebellion. There were over 300 attempts on slave ships in the slave trade. 300 attempts of rebellion on the ships. The most famous one, or the ones you hear about the most, you can rent a movie about it, is called Amistad. It explains how the enslaved people were coming over and they ended up in North America and how they went to court and they eventually were allowed to go back to Africa. It's a really good movie. And number 5 was abolition. Public speaking, anti-slavery newspaper like the National Watchman, the North Star, and the Freedman Journal. Also organized public opposition like protests, like the ones you see going on now with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the Memphis sanitation strike of 1968. There are many examples of enslaved people resisting slavery and fighting for their freedom. For example, Dinah Neville was a black woman who sued her slave owner, claiming that she was a free woman. She said she was not an enslaved person. She took him to court, but she lost the case. A group that was against slavery bought her and her children's freedom, and she was set free. This was one of the first cases that marked the beginning of organized resistance to slavery in North America. 2 years later, a group in Massachusetts sued for their freedom too, and in 1781, Elizabeth Freeman, after being assaulted by her slave owner, sued for her freedom, and she won. Enslaved people continued to resist slavery, and 100 years before the Supreme Court's landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision struck down racial segregation of public schools, one of Boston's most vocal civil rights activists, Benjamin Roberts, attempted to enroll his 5-year-old daughter in the local whites only public school near their house. The school rejected his daughter, who was named Sarah, and her father filed suit against the Boston School Board and the City of Boston in 1848 for its requirement that white and black children must attend separate schools. This was the first case challenging school segregation in the North, and it reached the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts in 1850. Sarah's father hired attorney Robert Morris, who was the first black lawyer admitted to the bar in Massachusetts, and he asserted that the separation of children by race was a violation of equality. However, the judge didn't see eye to eye, and the judge maintained that prejudice, if it did exist, was not created by the law, therefore could not be changed by the law. So Sarah had to continue to attend separate schools based on race outside of her neighborhood. They took the dispute from the classroom to the streets, and they protested, boycotted the school, and sent petitions to legislators, which is not much different than we do today. In 1851, they appealed to the legislative branch, and this bill failed also. All they were asking was for Sarah to be able to go to the school in her own neighborhood. After 7 years of fighting for Sarah's rights, finally, a bill prohibiting segregation in schools was signed into law, and segregation ended in Massachusetts. When we see protests going on today, we must remember that we have always fought to dismantle systemic racism. We have to remember our many successes with resisting inequality and inhumane treatment, and know that we will continue to be successful in our efforts. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were brought to this country against their will, sold by rich and powerful Africans, captured and kidnapped by Europeans to work for free, stolen and sold away from their families, stripped of their names, stripped of their languages, stripped of their customs, stripped of their dignity, and forced to work for free until they died. The Africans that sold the enslaved Africans were greedy, and the Europeans that bought the enslaved Africans were greedy. Even though so much was taken from our ancestors in an attempt to devalue them, our ancestors' blood still flows in our veins, and it refuses to be devalued. I am of value. You are of value. We are of value. We're going to finish up with some yoga poses today, just like last week. And the first pose will be warrior. And warrior, we're going to do that and tie it into the lesson because it's showing the resistance of our people. The second yoga pose is triangle. And that ties into the lesson because the transatlantic slave route was shaped like a triangle. So we're going to do triangle pose in remembrance of our ancestors that did not survive the Middle Passage. And then we'll finish up again with warrior, so we can show solidarity to the resistance efforts to inhumane treatment of our people today. So it's in support of the protests. We're going to start with warrior. So turn the foot in the front forward, and the other one is sideways, and you just bend your knee and go down. Look out over your hand, hold your head up, because we are warriors. We come from warrior people. Now we're going to go to triangle, so straighten your legs, keep your foot turned out, and just reach down over your foot and make a triangle. Look up at your hand. Come back up, straight ahead, bend that front leg, sink down, and look over that hand. Pull your head up. And remember, forever and always, keep your head up. And we'll finish with the question that I want to ask you based on the lesson. How would you feel about owning another person and making them do all of your work? Would it make you feel good about yourself? Or would you feel bad about yourself? Why or why not? Discuss this with your grown-up. Think about it. And just forever and always, keep your head up. I'll see you next week and we'll discuss reconstruction. Bye.